Pseudopod is extruded into this universe from a dimension of purest fear. It's beautiful in its own alien way, but what's to come will unsettle you.
Pseudopod, episode 650 for May 31st, 2019. The Detweiler Boy by Tom Reamy.
Lead me to a lonely place, dressed for opening time. Show me bleeding where my love burns you, breathing fire.
I'm Alex, co-editor of Pseudopod, your host this episode. 650 is a significant landmark for genre fiction's best-kept secret. Escape Artists has over a decade of content and over 2,000 stories in our back catalog. Another of genre fiction's best-kept secrets is Tom Reamy. He was nominated for the Hugo 4 times, won the Nebula, and won the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer. He was one of the founders of the Turkey City Writers' Workshop. He was loved by his peers and considered an heir to Bradbury's weird fiction tradition. Then, he tragically passed away 7 pages into his second novel. A shining star was darkened that day, and I can only imagine what great works we could have seen. Now his fiction is primarily out of print, and you have to dig into the dark corners of your used bookstore to find copies of his work. We dug deep and hope you seek out more of his work after this. If you want another taste, we produced Tom's story Beyond the Cleft as part of our Century of Horror, which is available to subscribers. The Detweiler Boy was first published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, April 1977. Thank you to Vaughn Hansen of the Virginia Kid Agency for helping us secure the rights to this story. Our narrator this week is Andrew Lehman. Andrew is one of the founders and proprietors of the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society and has produced and appeared in films, radio dramas, games, music, and audiobook projects based on or inspired by Lovecraft's works. Most notably, the best adaptation of Lovecraft to film with the brilliant motion picture of The Call of Cthulhu, as well as the Dark Adventure Radio Theater series. To get the full effect of Andrew's performance, we recommend you listen to this in stereo. But for those of you who are listening with a single earbud, we'll also make a mono file. This episode is dedicated to horror hosts in general, and Sinister Seymour in particular. Now, we have a story for you, and we promise you, it's true.
The Detweiler Boy. The room had been cleaned with pine oil disinfectant and smelled like a public toilet. Harry Spinner was on the floor behind the bed, scrunched down between it and the wall. The almost colorless chenille bedspread had been pulled askew, exposing part of the clean but dingy sheet. All I could see of Harry was one leg poking over the edge of the bed. He wasn't wearing a shoe, only a faded brown and tan argyle sock with a hole in it. The sock, long bereft of any elasticity, was crumpled around his thin, rusty ankle. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked around the end of the bed so I could see all of him. He was huddled on his back with his elbows propped up by the wall in the bed. His throat had been cut. The blood hadn't spread very far. Most of it had been soaked up by the threadbare carpet under the bed. I looked around the grubby little room but didn't find anything. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of forced entry. But then my Bank Americard hadn't left any signs either. The window was open, letting in the muffled roar of the traffic on the boulevard. I stuck my head out and looked, but it was 3 stories straight down to the neon-lit marquee of the movie house. It had been nearly 2 hours since Harry called me. "Bertram, my boy, I've run across something very peculiar. I don't really know what to make of it." I had put away the report I was writing on Lucas McGowan's hyperactive wife. She had a definite predilection for gas pump jockeys, car wash boys, and parking lot attendants. I guess it had something to do with the age of the automobile. I propped my feet on my desk and leaned back until the old swivel chair groaned a protest. "What did you find this time, Harry? A nest of international spies or an invasion from Mars?" I guess Harry Spinner wasn't much use to anyone, not even himself, but I liked him. He'd helped me in a couple of cases, nosing around in places only the Harry Spinners of the world can nose around in unnoticed. I was beginning to get the idea he was trying to play Dr. Watson to my Sherlock Holmes. "Don't tease me, Bertram. There's a boy here in the hotel. I saw something I don't think he wanted me to see. It's extremely odd." Harry was also the only person in the world except my mother who called me Bertram. "What did you see?" "I'd rather not talk about it over the phone. Can you come over?" Harry saw too many old Private Eye movies on the Late Show. "It'll be a while. I've got a client coming in a few minutes to pick up the poop on his wandering wife." "Bertram, you shouldn't waste your time and talent on divorce cases." "It pays the bills, Harry. Besides, there aren't enough Maltese Falcons to go around." By the time I filled Lucas McGowan in on all the details, I got the impression he was less concerned with his wife's infidelity than with her taste, that it wouldn't have been so bad if she'd been shacking up with movie stars or international playboys. Collected my fee and grabbed a Thursday special at Colonel Sanders. Almost 2 hours had passed. Harry hadn't answered my knock, and so I let myself in with a credit card. Bertie Pavlovitz was a fat, slovenly old broad somewhere between 40 and 200. She was blind in her right eye and wore a black felt patch over it. She claimed she had lost the eye in a fight with a Creole whore over a riverboat gambler. I believed her. She ran the Brewster Hotel the way Florence Nightingale must have run that stinking army hospital in the Crimea. Her tenants were the losers habitating that rotting section of the boulevard east of the Hollywood freeway. She bossed them, cursed them, loved them, and took care of them. Once, a couple of years ago, a young black buck thought an old fat lady with one eye would make easy pickings. The cops found him 3 days later, 2 blocks away, under some rubbish in an alley where he'd hidden. He had a broken arm, 2 cracked ribs, a busted nose, a few missing teeth, and was stone dead from internal hemorrhaging. The Brewster ran heavily in the red, but Bertie didn't mind. She had quite a bit of property in Westwood which ran very, very heavily in the black. She gave me an obscene leer as I approached the desk, but her good eye twinkled.
"Hello, lover,"
she brayed in a voice like a cracked boiler.
"I've lowered my price to $25. Are you interested?"
She saw my face, and her expression shifted from lewd to wary.
"What's wrong, Bert?"
"Harry Spinner. You better get the cops, Bertie. Somebody killed him." She looked at me, not saying anything, her face slowly collapsing into an infinitely weary resignation. Then she turned and telephoned the police. Because it was just Harry Spinner at the Brewster Hotel on the wrong end of Hollywood Boulevard, the cops took over half an hour to get there. While we waited, I told Bertie everything I knew about the phone call and what I'd found.
"He must have been talking about the Detweiler Boy," she said, frowning. "Harry's been kind of friendly with him. Felt sorry for him, I guess."
"What's his room? I'd like to talk to him."
"He checked out."
"When?"
"Just before you came down."
"Damn." She bit her lip.
"I don't think the Detweiler Boy killed him."
"Why?"
"I just don't think he could. He's such a gentle boy."
"Oh, Bertie," I groaned. "You know there's no such thing as a killer type. Almost anyone will kill with a good enough reason."
"I know," she sighed, "but I still can't believe it."
She tapped her scarlet fingernails on the dulled Formica desktop.
"How long had Harry been dead?"
He had phoned me about 10 after 5. I had found the body at 7. "A while," I said. "The blood was mostly dry."
"Before 6:30?
"Probably." She sighed again, but this time with relief.
"The Detweiler Boy was down here with me until 6:30. He'd been here since about 4:15. We were playing gin. He was having one of his spells and wanted company."
"What kind of spell? Tell me about him, Bertie."
"But he couldn't have killed Harry,"
she protested. "Okay," I said, but I wasn't entirely convinced. Why would anyone deliberately and brutally murder inoffensive, invisible Harry Spinner right after he told me he had discovered something peculiar about the Detweiler Boy, except the Detweiler Boy? Tell me anyway. If he and Harry were friendly, he might know something. Why do you keep calling him a boy? How old is he?" She nodded and leaned her bulk on the registration desk.
"Early 20s, 22, 23 maybe. Not very tall, about 5'5" or 6. Slim, dark curly hair, a real good-looking boy. Looks like a movie star, except for his back.
His back?
He has a hump. He's a hunchback.
That stopped me for a minute, but I'm not sure why. I must have had a mental picture of Charles Lawton riding those bells, or Igor stealing that brain from the laboratory. He's good-looking, and he's a hunchback?
Sure.
She raised her eyebrows. The one over the patch didn't go up as high as the other.
If you see him from the front, you can't even tell.
What's his first name?
Andrew.
How long has he been living here? She consulted a file card.
He checked in last Friday night, the 22nd, 6 days.
What's this spell he was having?
I don't know for sure. It was the second one he'd had. He would get pale and nervous. I think he was in a lot of pain. It would get worse and worse all day. Then he'd be fine, all rosy and healthy looking.
Sounds to me like he was hurting for a fix.
I thought so at first, but I changed my mind. I've seen enough of that, and it wasn't the same. Take my word, he was real bad this evening. He came down about 4:15, like I said. He didn't complain, but I could tell he was wanting company to take his mind off it. We played gin until 6:30. Then he went back upstairs. About 20 minutes later, he came down with his old suitcase and checked out. He looked fine, all over his spell.
Did he have a doctor?
I'm pretty sure he didn't. I asked him about it. He said there was nothing to worry about. It would pass. And it did.
Did he say why he was leaving or where he was going?
No, just said he was restless and wanted to be moving on. Sure hated to see him leave. A real nice kid.
When the cops finally got there, I told them all I knew, except I didn't mention the Detweiler boy. I hung around until I found out that Harry almost certainly wasn't killed after 6:30. They set the time somewhere between 5:10 when he called me and 6. It looked like Andrew Detweiler was innocent. But what peculiar thing had Harry noticed about him? And why had he moved out right after Harry was killed? Bertie let me take a look at his room, but I didn't find a thing, not even an abandoned paperclip. Friday morning I sat at my desk trying to put the pieces together. Trouble was, I only had 2 pieces, and they didn't fit. The sun was coming in off the boulevard, shining through the window, projecting the chipping letters painted on the glass against the wall in front of me. Bert Mallory, Confidential Investigations. I got up and looked out. This section of the boulevard wasn't rotting yet, but it wouldn't be long. There's one sure gauge for judging a part of town: the movie theaters. It never fails. For instance, a new picture hadn't opened in downtown L.A. in a long, long time. The action 10 years ago was on the boulevard. Now it's in Westwood. The grand old Pantages, east of Vine, and too near the freeway used to be the site of the most glittering premieres. They even had the Oscar ceremonies there for a while. Now it shows exploitation and double-feature horror films. Only Grauman's Chinese and the once Paramount, once Lowe's, now Downtown Cinema or something, at the West End got good openings. The New View, across the street and down, was showing an X-rated double feature. It was too depressing, so I closed the blind. Miss Tremaine looked up from her typing at the rattle and frowned. Her desk was out in the small reception area, but I had arranged both desks so we could see each other and talk in normal voices when the door was open. It stayed open most of the time, except when I had a client who felt secretaries shouldn't know his troubles. She had been transcribing the Lucas McGowan report for half an hour, humphing and tisk-tisking at 30-second intervals. She was having a marvelous time. Miss Tremaine was about 45, looked like a constipated librarian, and was the best secretary I'd ever had. She'd been with me 7 years. I'd tried a few young and sexy ones, but it hadn't worked out. Either they wouldn't play at all, or they wanted to play all the time. Both kinds were a pain in the ass to face first thing in the morning, every morning. Miss Tremaine, will you get Gus Verdugo on the phone, please? Yes, Mr. Mallory. She dialed the phone nimbly, sitting as if she were wearing a back brace. Gus Verdugo worked in R&I. I had done him a favor once, and he insisted on returning it tenfold. I gave him everything I had on Andrew Detweiler and asked him if he'd mind running it through the computer. He wouldn't mind. He called back in 15 minutes. The computer had never heard of Andrew Detweiler and had only 7 hunchbacks, none of them fitting Detweiler's description. I was sitting there, wondering how in hell I would find him, when the phone rang again. Miss Tremaine stopped typing and lifted the receiver without breaking rhythm. Mr. Mallory's office, she said crisply, really letting the caller know he'd hooked onto an efficient organization. She put her hand over the mouthpiece and looked at me. It's for you. An obscene phone call. She didn't bat an eyelash or twitch a muscle. "Thanks," I said, and winked at her. She dropped the receiver back on the cradle from a height of 3 inches and went back to typing. Grinning, I picked up my phone. "Hello, Janice," I said. "Just a minute till my ear stops ringing," the husky voice tickled my ear. "What are you doing up this early?" I asked. Janice Fenwick was an exotic dancer at a club on the Strip nights and was working on her master's in oceanography at UCLA in the afternoons. In the year I'd known her, I'd seldom seen her stick her nose into the sunlight before 11. "I had to catch you before you started following that tiresome woman with the car." "I've finished that. She's picked up her last parking lot attendant, at least with this husband," I chuckled. "I'm glad to hear it. What's up?" "I haven't had an indecent proposition from you in days, so I thought I'd make one of my own." "I'm all ears." "We're doing some diving off Catalina tomorrow. Want to come along?" "Not much we can do in a wetsuit." "The wetsuit comes off about 4. Then we'll have Saturday night and all of Sunday. Best indecent proposition I've had all week." Miss Tremaine humphed. It might have been over something in the report, but I don't think it was. I picked up Janice at her apartment in Westwood early Saturday morning. She was waiting for me and came striding out to the car all legs and healthy golden flesh. She was wearing white shorts, sneakers, and that damn Dallas Cowboys jersey. It was authentic. The name and number on it were quite well known, even to non-football fans. She wouldn't tell me how she got it, just smirked and looked smug. She tossed her suitcase in the back seat and slid up against me. She smelled like sunshine. We flew over and spent most of the day glubbing around in the Pacific with a bunch of kids 15 years younger than I and 5 years younger than Janice. I'd been on these jaunts with Janice before and enjoyed them so much I'd bought my own wetsuit. But I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I did Saturday night and all of Sunday. I got back to my apartment on Beechwood fairly late Sunday night and barely had time to get something to eat at the Mexican restaurant around the corner on Melrose. They have marvelous carne asada. I live right across the street from Paramount, right across from the door people go in to see them tape The Odd Couple. Every Friday night when I see them lining up out there, I think I might go someday, but I never seem to get around to it. You might think I'd seen a few movie stars living where I do, but I haven't. I did see Seymour occasionally when he worked at Channel 9, before he went to work for Gene Autry at Channel 5. I was so pleasantly pooped I completely forgot about Andrew Detweiler, until Monday morning when I was sitting at my desk reading the Times. It was a small story on page 3, not very exciting or newsworthy. Last night a man named Maurice Millian, age 51, had fallen through the plate-glass doors leading onto the terrace of the high-rise where he lived. He had been discovered about midnight when the people living below him had noticed dried blood on their terrace. The only thing to connect the deaths of Harry Spinner and Maurice Millian was a lot of blood flowing around. If Millian had been murdered, there might be a link, however tenuous. But Millian's death was accidental, a dumb, stupid accident. It niggled around in my brain for an hour before I gave in. There was only one way to get it out of my head. "Miss Tremaine, I'll be back in an hour or so. If any slinky blondes come in wanting me to find their kid sisters, tell them to wait." She humphed again and ignored me. The Almsbury was 6 blocks away on Yucca, so I walked. It was a rectangular monolith about 8 stories tall, not real new, not too old, but expensive looking. The small terraces protruded in neat, orderly rows. The long, narrow grounds were immaculate, with a lot of succulents that looked like they might have been imported from Mars. There were also the inevitable palm trees and clumps of birds of paradise. A small, discreet, polished placard dangled in a wrought iron frame proclaiming, ever so softly, "No vacancy." 2 willowy young men gave me appraising glances in the carpeted lobby as they exited into the sunlight like exotic jungle birds. It's one of those, I thought. My suspicions were confirmed when I looked over the tenant directory. All the names seemed to be male, but none of them was Andrew Detweiler. Maurice Millian was still listed as 407. I took the elevator to 4 and rang the bell of 409. The bell played a few notes of Bach, or maybe Vivaldi or Telemann. All those old Baroques sound alike to me. The vision of loveliness who opened the door was about 40, almost as slim as Twiggy, but as tall as I. He wore a flowered silk shirt open to the waist, exposing his bony, hairless chest, and tight white pants that might as well have been made of saran wrap. He didn't say anything, just let his eyebrows rise inquiringly as his eyes flicked down, then up. "Good morning," I said, and showed him my ID. He blanched. His eyes became marbles brimming with terror. He was about to panic, tensing to slam the door. I smiled my friendly, disarming smile and went on as if I hadn't noticed. "I'm inquiring about a man named Andrew Detweiler." The terror trickled from his eyes, and I could see his thin chest throbbing. He gave me a blank look that meant he'd never heard the name. "He's about 22, I continued. "Dark curly hair, very good-looking." He grinned wryly, calming down, trying to cover his panic. "Aren't they all?" he said. "Detweiler is a hunchback." His smile contracted suddenly. His eyebrows shot up. "Oh," he said. "Him. Bingo. Mallory, you've led a clean, wholesome life, and it's paying off." "Does he live in the building?" I swallowed to get my heart back in place and blinked a couple of times to clear away the skyrockets. "No, he was visiting." "May I come in and talk to you about him?" He was holding the door 3/4 shut, and so I couldn't see anything in the room but an expensive-looking color TV. He glanced over his shoulder nervously at something behind him. The inner ends of his eyebrows drooped in a frown. He looked back at me and started to say something, then, with a small defiance, shrugged his eyebrows. "Sure, but there's not much I can tell you." He pushed the door all the way open and stepped back. It was a good-sized living room come to life from the pages of a decorator magazine. A kitchen behind a half wall was on my right. A hallway led somewhere on my left. Directly in front of me were double sliding glass doors leading to the terrace. On the terrace was a bronzed hunk of beef stretched out nude, trying to get bronzer. The hunk opened his eyes and looked at me. He apparently decided I wasn't competition and closed them again. Tall and lanky indicated one of 2 identical orange and brown striped couches facing each other across a football field-size marble and glass cocktail table. He sat on the other one, took a cigarette from an alabaster box and lit it with an alabaster lighter. As an afterthought, he offered me one. "Who was Detweiler visiting?" I asked as I lit my cigarette. The lighter felt cool and expensive in my hand. "Maurice, next door." He inclined his head slightly toward 407. "Isn't he the one who was killed in an accident last night?" He blew a stream of smoke from pursed lips and tapped his cigarette on the alabaster ashtray. "Yes," he said. "How long had Maurice and Detweiler known each other?" "Not long." "How long?" He snuffed his cigarette out on pure white alabaster and sat so prim and pristine I would have bet his feces came out wrapped in cellophane. He shrugged his eyebrows again. "Maurice picked him up somewhere the other night." "Which night?" He thought a moment. "Thursday, I think." "Yes, Thursday." "Was Detweiler a hustler?" He crossed his legs like a 40s pin-up and dangled his Roman sandal. His lips twitched scornfully. "If he was, he would have starved. He was deformed." Maurice didn't seem to mind. He sniffed and lit another cigarette. "When did Detweiler leave?" He shrugged. "I saw him yesterday afternoon. I was out last night, until quite late." "How did they get along? Did they quarrel or fight?" "I have no idea. I only saw them in the hall a couple of times. Maurice and I were not close." He stood, fidgety. "There's really not anything I can tell you. Why don't you ask David and Murray? They and Maurice were thick as thieves." "David and Murray?" "Across the hall, 408. I stood up. "I'll do that. Thank you very much." I looked at the plate glass doors. "I guess it would be pretty easy to walk through one of them if you thought it was open." "Are all the apartments alike, those terrace doors?" He nodded. "Ticky-tacky. Thanks again. Don't mention it." He opened the door for me and then closed it behind me. I sighed and walked across to 408. I rang the bell. It didn't play anything, just went bing-bong. David, or Murray, was about 25, red-headed and freckled. He had a slim, muscular body which was also freckled. I could tell because he was wearing only a pair of jeans, cut off very short and split up the sides to the waistband. He was barefooted and had a smudge of green paint on his nose. He had an open, friendly face and gave me a neutral smile for a stranger. "Yes?" he asked. I showed him my ID. Instead of going pale, he only looked interested. "I was told by the man in 409 you might be able to tell me something about Andrew Detweiler." "Andy?" He frowned slightly. "Come on in. I'm David Fowler." He held out his hand. I shook it. "Bert Mallory." The apartment couldn't have been more different from the one across the hall. It was comfortable and cluttered, and dominated by a drafting table surrounded by jars of brushes and boxes of paint tubes. Architecturally, however, it was almost identical. The terrace was covered with potted plants rather than naked muscles. David Fowler sat on the stool at the drafting table and began cleaning brushes. When he sat, the split in his shorts opened and exposed half his butt, which was also freckled. But I got the impression he wasn't exhibiting himself, he was just completely indifferent. "What do you want to know about Andy?" "Everything." He laughed. "That lets me out. Sit down. Move the stuff." I cleared a space on the couch and sat. "How did Detweiler and Maurice get along?" He gave me a knowing look. "Fine, as far as I know. Maurice liked to pick up stray puppies. Andy was a stray puppy." "Was Detweiler a hustler?" He laughed again. "No, I doubt if he knew what the word means. Was he gay?" "No." "How do you know?" He grinned. "Haven't you heard? We can spot each other a mile away." "Would you like some coffee?" "Yes, I would, thank you." He went to the half wall separating the kitchen and poured 2 cups from a pot that looked like it was kept hot and full all the time. "It's hard to describe Andy. There was something very little boyish about him, a real innocent. Delighted with everything new. It's sad about his back, real sad." He handed me a cup and returned to the stool. "There was something very secretive about him. Not about his feelings, he was very open about things like that." "Did he and Maurice have sex together?" "No. I told you it was a stray puppy relationship. I wish Murray were here. He's much better with words than I am. I'm visually oriented." "Where is he?" "At work. He's a lawyer." "Do you think Detweiler could have killed Maurice?" "No." "Why? He was here with us all evening. We had dinner and played Scrabble. I think he was real sick, but he tried to pretend he wasn't. Even if he hadn't been here, I would not think so." "When was the last time you saw him?" "He left about a half hour before they found Maurice. I imagine he went over there, saw Maurice dead, and decided to disappear. Can't say I blame him. The police might have gotten some funny ideas. We didn't mention him." "Why not?" "There was no point in getting him involved. It was just an accident." "He couldn't have killed Maurice after he left here?" "No. They said he'd been dead over an hour. What did Desmond tell you?" "Desmond? Across the hall. The one who looks like he smelled something bad." "How did you know I talked to him and not the side of beef?" He laughed and almost dropped his coffee cup. "I don't think Roy can talk." He didn't know nothing about nothing. I found myself laughing also. I got up and walked to the glass doors. I slid them open and then shut again. "Did you ever think one of these was open when it was really shut?" "No, but I've heard of it happening." I sighed. "So have I." I turned and looked at what he was working on at the drafting table. It was a small painting of a boy and girl, she in a soft white dress and he in jeans and t-shirt. They looked about 15. They were embracing, about to kiss. It was quite obviously the first time for both of them. It was good. I told him so. He grinned with pleasure. "Thanks. It's for a paperback cover." "Whose idea was it that Detweiler have dinner and spend the evening with you?" He thought for a moment. "Maurice." He looked up at me and grinned. "Do you know stamps?" It took me a second to realize what he meant. "You mean stamp collecting? Not much." Maurice was a philatelist. He specialized in post-war Germany, locals and zones, things like that. He'd gotten a kilo of buildings and wanted to sort them undisturbed. I shook my head. "You've lost me, a kilo of buildings." He laughed. "It's a set of 28 stamps issued in the American zone in 1948, showing famous German buildings. Conditions in Germany were still pretty chaotic at the time, and the stamps were printed under fairly makeshift circumstances. Consequently, there's an enormous variety of different perforations, watermarks, and engravings, hundreds, as a matter of fact. Maurice could spend hours and hours poring over them." "Are they valuable?" "No, very common. Some of the varieties are hard to find, but they're not valuable." He gave me a knowing look. Nothing was missing from Maurice's apartment. I shrugged. It had occurred to me to wonder where Detweiler got his money. "I don't know. The subject never came up. He wasn't being defensive." "You liked him, didn't you?" There was a weary sadness in his eyes. "Yes," he said. That afternoon I picked up Bertie Pavlovitz at the Brewster Hotel and took her to Harry Spinner's funeral. I told her about Maurice Millian and Andrew Detweiler. We talked it around and around. The Detweiler boy obviously couldn't have killed Harry or Millian, but it was stretching coincidence a little bit far. After the funeral, I went to the Los Angeles Public Library and started checking back issues of the Times. I'd only made it back 3 weeks when the library closed. The LA Times is thick, and unless the death is sensational or the dead prominent, the story might be tucked in anywhere except the classifieds. Last Tuesday, the 26th, a girl had cut her wrists with a razor blade in North Hollywood. The day before, Monday, the 25th, a girl had miscarried and hemorrhaged. She had bled to death because she and her boyfriend were stoned out of their heads. They lived a block off Western, very near the Brewster, and Detweiler was at the Brewster Monday. Sunday, the 24th, a wino had been knifed in MacArthur Park. Saturday, the 23rd, I had 3. A knifing in a bar on Pico, a shooting in a rooming house on Irolo, and a rape and knifing in an alley off La Brea. Only the gunshot victim had bled to death, but there had been a lot of blood in all 3. Friday, the 22nd, the same day Detweiler checked in the Brewster, a 2-year-old boy had fallen on an upturned rake in his backyard on Larchmont, only 8 or 10 blocks from where I lived on Beechwood. And a couple of Chicano kids had had a knife fight behind Hollywood High. One was dead and the other was in jail. Ah, machismo. The list went on, all the way back to Thursday, the 7th. On that day was another slashed-wrist suicide near Western in Wilshire. The next morning, Tuesday the 3rd, I called Miss Tremaine and told her I'd be late getting in, but would check in every couple of hours to find out if the slinky blonde looking for her kid sister had shown up. She humphed. Larchmont is a middle-class neighborhood, huddled in between the old wealth around the country club and the blight spreading down Melrose from Western Avenue. It tries to give the impression of suburbia, and does a pretty good job of it, rather than just another nearly downtown shopping center. The area isn't big on apartments or rooming houses, but there are a few. I found the Detweiler boy at the 3rd one I checked. It was a block and a half from where the little kid fell on the rake. According to the landlord, at the time of the kid's death, Detweiler was playing bridge with him and a couple of elderly old maid sisters in number 12. He hadn't been feeling well and had moved out later that evening to catch a bus to San Diego to visit his ailing mother. The landlord had felt sorry for him, so sorry he'd broken a steadfast rule and refunded most of the month's rent Detweiler had paid in advance. After all, he'd only been there 3 days. So sad about his back. Such a nice, gentle boy. A writer, you know. No, I didn't know, but it explained how he could move around so much without seeming to work. I called David Fowler. Yes, Andy had a portable typewriter, but he hadn't mentioned being a writer. And Bertie Pavlovitz.
Yeah, he typed a lot in his room.
I found the Detweiler boy again on the 16th and the 19th. He'd moved into a rooming house near Silver Lake Park on the night of the 13th, and moved out again on the 19th. The landlady hadn't refunded his money, but she gave him an alibi for the knifing of an old man in the park on the 16th, and the suicide of a girl in the same rooming house on the 19th. He'd been in the pink of health when he moved in, sick on the 16th, healthy the 17th, and sick again the 19th. It was like a rerun. He lived a block away from where a man was mugged, killed, and robbed in an alley on the 13th, though the details of the murder didn't seem to fit the pattern. But he was sick, had an alibi, and moved to Silver Lake. Rerun it on the 10th. A woman slipped in the bathtub and fell through the glass shower doors, cutting herself to ribbons. Sick, alibi, moved. It may be because I was always rotten in math, but it wasn't until right then that I figured out Detweiler's timetable. Millian died the 1st, Harry Spinner the 28th, the miscarriage the 25th, the little kid on the 22nd, Silver Lake on the 16th and 19th, etc., etc., etc. A bloody death occurred in Detweiler's general vicinity every 3rd day. But I couldn't figure out a pattern for the victims. Male, female, little kids, old aunties, married, unmarried, rich, poor, young, old. No pattern of any kind, and there's always a pattern. I even checked to see if the names were in alphabetical order. I got back to my office at 6. Miss Tremaine sat primly at her desk, cleared of everything but her purse and a notepad. She reminded me quite a lot of Desmond. "What are you still doing here, Miss Tremaine? You should have left an hour ago." I sat at my desk, leaned back until the swivel chair groaned twice, and propped my feet up. She picked up the pad. "I wanted to give you your calls." "Can't they wait? I've been sleuthing all day, and I'm bushed." "No one is paying you to find this Detweiler person, are they?" "No." Your bank statement came today. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. A good secretary keeps her employer informed. I was informing you. Okay, who called? She consulted the pad, but I'd bet my last gumshoe she knew every word on it by heart. A Mrs. Carmichael called. Her French poodle has been kidnapped. She wants you to find her. Ye gods, why doesn't she go to the police? Because she's positive her ex-husband is the kidnapper. She doesn't want to get him in any trouble. She just wants Gwendolen back. Gwendolen? Gwendolen. A Mrs. Bushyeager came by. She wants you to find her little sister. I sat up so fast I almost fell out of the chair. I gave her a long, hard stare, but her neutral expression didn't flicker. You're kidding. Her eyebrows rose a millimeter. Was she a slinky blonde? No, she was a dumpy brunette. I settled back in the chair, trying not to laugh. Why does Mrs. Bushyeager want me to find her little sister? I sputtered. Because Mrs. Bushyeager thinks she's shacked up somewhere with Mr. Bushyeager. She'd like you to call her tonight. Tomorrow. I've got a date with Janice tonight. She reached in her desk drawer and pulled out my bank statement. She dropped it on the desk with a papery plop. Don't worry, I assured her. I won't spend much money. Just a little spaghetti and wine tonight and ham and eggs in the morning. She humphed. My point. Anything else? A Mr. Bloomfeld called. He wants you to get the goods on Mrs. Bloomfeld so he can sue for divorce. I sighed. Miss Tremaine closed the pad. Okay. No to Mrs. Carmichael and make appointments for Bushyeager and Bloomfeld. She lowered her eyelids at me. I spread my hands. Would Sam Spade go looking for a French poodle named Gwendolen? He might if he had your bank statement. Mr. Bloomfeld will be in at 2. Mrs. Bushyeager at 3. Miss Tremaine, you'd make somebody a wonderful mother. She didn't even humph. She just picked up her purse and stalked out. I swiveled the chair around and looked at the calendar. Tomorrow was the 4th. Somebody would die tomorrow, and Andrew Detweiler would be close by. I scooted up in bed and leaned against the headboard. Janice snorted into the pillow and opened one eye, pinning me with it. I didn't mean to wake you, I said. What's the matter? She muttered. Too much spaghetti? No, too much Andrew Detweiler. She scooted up beside me, keeping the sheet over her breasts, and turned on the light. She rummaged around on the nightstand for a cigarette. Who wants to divorce him? That's mean, Janice, I groaned. You want a cigarette? Yeah. She put 2 cigarettes in her mouth and lit them both. She handed me one. You don't look a bit like Paul Henreid, I said. She grinned. That's funny. You look like Betty Davis. Who's Andrew Detweiler? So I told her. It's elementary, my dear Sherlock, she said. Andrew Detweiler is a vampire. I frowned at her. Of course, he's a clever vampire. Vampires are usually stupid. They always give themselves away by leaving those 2 little teeth marks on people's jugulars. Darling, even vampires have to be at the scene of the crime. He always has an alibi, huh? I got out of bed and headed for the bathroom. That's suspicious in itself. When I came out, she said, Why? Innocent people usually don't have alibis, especially not one every 3 days. Which is probably why innocent people get put in jail so often. I chuckled and sat on the edge of the bed. You may be right. Bert, do that again. I looked at her over my shoulder. Do what? Go to the bathroom. I don't think I can. My bladder only holds so much. I don't mean that. Walk over to the bathroom door. I gave her a suspicious frown, got up, and walked over to the bathroom door. I turned around, crossed my arms, and leaned against the doorframe. Well? She grinned. You've got a cute rear end. Almost as cute as Burt Reynolds. Maybe he's twins. What? I practically screamed. Maybe Andrew Detweiler is twins. One of them commits the murders and the other establishes the alibis. Twin vampires? She frowned. That's a bit much, isn't it? Had they discovered blood groups in Bram Stoker's day? I got back in bed and pulled the sheet up to my waist, leaning beside her against the headboard. I haven't the foggiest idea. That's another way vampires are stupid. They never check the victim's blood group. The wrong blood group can kill you. Well, vampires don't exactly get transfusions. It all amounts to the same thing, doesn't it? I shrugged. Oh well, she sighed. Vampires are stupid. She reached over and plucked at the hair on my chest. I haven't had an indecent proposition in hours, she said, grinning. So, I made one. Wednesday morning I made a dozen phone calls. Of the 9 victims I knew about, I was able to find the information on 6. All 6 had the same blood group. I lit a cigarette and leaned back in the swivel chair. The whole thing was spinning around in my head. I'd found a pattern for the victims, but I didn't know if it was the pattern. It just didn't make sense. Maybe Detweiler was a vampire. "Mallory," I said out loud, "you're cracking up." Miss Tremaine glanced up. "If I were you, I'd listen to you," she said, poker-faced. The next morning I staggered out of bed at 6 a.m. I took a cold shower, shaved, dressed, and put murine in my eyes. They still felt like I'd washed them in rubber cement. Mrs. Bloomfeld had kept me up until 2 the night before, doing all the night spots in Santa Monica with some dude I hadn't identified yet. When they checked into a motel, I went home and went to bed. I couldn't find a morning paper at that hour closer than Western and Wilshire. The story was on page 7. Fortunately, they found the body in time for the early edition. A woman named Sybil Herndon, age 38, had committed suicide in an apartment on Las Palmas. Detweiler hadn't gone very far. The address was just around the corner from the Almsbury. She had cut her wrists on a piece of broken mirror. She had been discovered about 11:30 when the manager went over to ask her to turn down the volume on her television set. It was too early to drop around, and so I ate breakfast, hoping this was one of the times Detweiler stuck around for more than 3 days. Not for a minute did I doubt he would be living at the apartment court on Las Palmas, or not far away. The owner-manager of the court was one of those creatures peculiar to Hollywood. She must have been a starlet in the 20s or 30s, but success had eluded her, so she had tried to freeze herself in time. She still expected at any moment a call from the studio. But her flesh hadn't cooperated. Her hair was the color of tarnished copper, and the fire-engine red lipstick was painted far past her thin lips. Her watery eyes peered at me through a Lone Ranger mask of Maybelline on a plaster-white face. Her dress had obviously been copied from the wardrobe of Norma Shearer. "Yes?" She had a breathy voice. Her eyes quickly traveled the length of my body. That happens often enough to keep me feeling good, but this time it gave me a queasy sensation, like I was being measured for a mummy case. I showed her my ID and asked if I could speak to her about one of the tenants. "Of course. Come on in. I'm Lorraine Nesbit." Was there a flicker of disappointment that I hadn't recognized the name? She stepped back, holding the door for me. I could tell that detectives, private or otherwise, asking about her tenants wasn't a new thing. I walked into the doilied room, and she looked at me from 100 directions. The faded photographs covered every level surface and clung to the walls like leeches. She had been quite a dish 40 years ago. She saw me looking at the photos and smiled. The makeup around her mouth cracked. "Which one do you want to ask me about?" The smile vanished, and the cracks closed. "Andrew Detweiler." She looked blank. "Young, good-looking, with a hunchback?" The cracks opened. "Oh, yes, he's only been here a few days." The name had slipped my mind. "He's still here?" "Oh, yes," she sighed. "It's so unfair for such a beautiful young man to have a physical impairment. What can you tell me about him?" "Not much. He's only been here since Sunday night. He's very handsome, like an angel. A dark angel. But it wasn't his handsomeness that attracted me." She smiled. "I've seen many handsome men in my day, you know. It's difficult to verbalize. He has such an incredible innocence, a lost, doomed look that Byron must have had, a vulnerability that makes you want to shield him and protect him. I don't know for sure what it is, but it struck a chord in my soul." "Soul," she mused. "Maybe that's it. He wears his soul on his face." She nodded as if to herself. "A dangerous thing to do." She looked back up at me. "If that quality, whatever it is, would photograph, he would become a star overnight, whether he could act or not. Except, of course, for his infirmity." Lorraine Nesbit, I decided, was as nutty as a fruitcake. Someone entered the room. He stood leaning against the doorframe, looking at me with sleepy eyes. He was about 25, wearing tight chinos without underwear and a T-shirt. His hair was tousled and cut unfashionably short. He had a good-looking Kansas face. The haircut made me think he was new in town, but the eyes said he wasn't. I guess the old broad liked his hair that way. She simpered. "Oh, Johnny, come on in. This detective was asking about Andrew Detweiler in number 7. She turned back to me. "This is my protégé, Johnny Peacock, a very talented young man. I'm arranging for a screen test as soon as Mr. Goldwyn returns my calls." She lowered her eyelids demurely. I was a Goldwyn girl, you know. Funny, I thought Goldwyn was dead. Maybe he wasn't. Johnny took the news of his impending stardom with total unconcern. He moved to the couch and sat down, yawning. Detweiler. Don't think I ever laid eyes on the man. What did he do? Nothing. Just routine. Obviously, he thought I was a police detective. No point in changing his mind. Where was he last night when the Herndon woman died? In his room, I think. I heard his typewriter. He wasn't feeling well, Lorraine Nesbit said. Then she sucked air through her teeth and clamped her fingers to her scarlet lips. Do you think he had something to do with that? Detweiler had broken his pattern. He didn't have an alibi. I couldn't believe it. Oh, Lorraine, Johnny grumbled. I turned to him. Do you know where Detweiler was? He shrugged. No idea. Then why are you so sure he had nothing to do with it? She committed suicide. How do you know for sure? That door was bolted from the inside. They had to break it down to get in. What about the window? Was it locked too? No, the window was open, but it has bars on it. No way anybody could get in. When I couldn't get her to answer my knock last night, I went around to the window and looked in. She was lying there with blood all over. She began to sniffle. Johnny got up and put his arms around her. He looked at me, grinned, and shrugged. Do you have a vacancy? I asked, getting a whiz-bang idea. Yes, she said, the sniffles disappearing instantly. I have 2. Actually 3, but I can't rent Miss Herndon's room for a few days, until someone claims her things. I'd like to rent the one closest to number 7, I said. I wasn't lucky enough to get number 6 or 8, but I did get 5. Lorraine Nesbit's nameless, dingy apartment court was a flea bag. Number 5 was one room with a closet, a tiny kitchen, and a tiny bath, identical with the other 9 units, she assured me. With a good deal of tugging and grunting, the couch turned into a lumpy bed. The refrigerator looked as if someone had spilled a bottle of Brer Rabbit back in 1938 and hadn't cleaned it up yet. The stove looked like a lube rack. Well, I sighed, it was only for 3 days. I had to pay a month's rent in advance anyway, but I put it down as a bribe to keep Lorraine's and Johnny's mouths shut about my being a detective. I moved in enough clothes for 3 days, some sheets and pillows, took another look at the kitchen, and decided to eat out. I took a jug of Lysol to the bathroom and crossed my fingers. Miss Tremaine brought up the bank statement and humphed a few times. Number 5 had 1 door and 4 windows, identical to the other 9, Lorraine assured me. The door had a heavy-duty bolt that couldn't be fastened or unfastened from the outside. The window beside the door didn't open at all and wasn't intended to. The bathroom and kitchen windows cranked out and were tall and skinny, about 24 by 6. The other living room window, opposite the door, slid upward. The iron bars bolted to the frame were so rusted I doubted if they could be removed without ripping out the whole window. It appeared Andrew Detweiler had another perfect alibi after all, along with the rest of the world. I stood outside number 7, suddenly feeling like a teenager about to pick up his first date. I could hear Detweiler's typewriter tickety-ticking away inside. Okay, Mallory, this is what you've been breaking your neck on for a week. I knocked on the door. I heard the typewriter stop ticking and the scrape of a chair being scooted back. I didn't hear anything else for 15 or 20 seconds, and I wondered what he was doing. Then the bolt was drawn, and the door opened. He was buttoning his shirt. That must have been the delay. He wouldn't want anyone to see him with his shirt off. Everything I'd been told about him was true. He wasn't very tall. The top of his head came to my nose. He was dark, though not as dark as I'd expected. I couldn't place his ancestry. It certainly wasn't Latin American, and I didn't think it was Slavic. His features were soft, without the angularity usually found in the Mediterranean races. His hair wasn't quite black. It wasn't exactly long, and it wasn't exactly short. His clothes were nondescript. Everything about him was neutral, except his face. It was just about as Lorraine Nesbit had described it. If you called Central Casting and asked for a male angel, you would get Andrew Detweiler in a blonde wig. His body was slim and well-formed. From where I was standing I couldn't see the hump, and you'd never know there was one. I had a glimpse of his bare chest as he buttoned his shirt. It wasn't muscular, but it was very well made. He was very healthy-looking, pink and flushed with health, though slightly pale as if he didn't get out in the sun much. His dark eyes were astounding. If you blocked out the rest of his face, leaving nothing but the eyes, you would swear he was no more than 4 years old. You've seen little kids with those big, guileless, unguarded, inquiring eyes, haven't you? Yes? He asked. I smiled. Hello, I'm Bert Mallory. I just moved into number 5. Miss Nesbit tells me you like to play gin. Yes, he said, grinning. Come on in. He turned to move out of the way, and I saw the hump. I don't know how to describe what I felt. I suddenly had a hurting in my gut. I felt the same unfairness and sadness the others had, the way you would feel about any beautiful thing with one overwhelming flaw. I'm not disturbing you, am I? I heard the typewriter. The room was indeed identical to mine, though it looked 100% more livable. I couldn't put my finger on what he had done to make it that way. Maybe it was just the semi-darkness. He had the curtains tightly closed, and one lamp lit beside the typewriter. Yeah, I was working on a story, but I'd rather play gin. He grinned, open and artless. If I could make money playing gin, I wouldn't write. Lots of people make money playing gin. Oh, I couldn't. I'm too unlucky. He certainly had a right to say that, but there was no self-pity, just an observation. Then he looked at me with slightly distressed eyes. You, didn't want to play for money, did you? Not at all, I said, and his eyes cleared. What kind of stories do you write? Oh, all kinds, he shrugged. Fantasy, mostly. Do you sell them? Most of them. I don't recall seeing your name anywhere. Miss Nesbit said it was Andrew Detweiler? He nodded. I use another name. You probably wouldn't know it either. It's not exactly a household word. His eyes said he'd really rather not tell me what it was. He had a slight accent, a sort of soft slowness, not exactly a drawl, and not exactly deep south. He shoved the typewriter over and pulled out a deck of cards. Where are you from? I asked. I don't place the accent. He grinned and shuffled the cards. North Carolina, back in the Blue Ridge. We cut and I dealt. How long have you been in Hollywood? About 2 months. How do you like it? He grinned his beguiling grin and picked up my discard. It's very unusual. Have you lived here very long, Mr. Mallory? Bert. All my life. I was born in Inglewood. My mother still lives there. It must be unusual to live in the same place all your life. You move around a lot? Yeah. Gin. I laughed. I thought you were unlucky. If we were playing for money, I wouldn't be able to do anything right. We played gin the rest of the afternoon and talked. Talked a lot. Detweiler seemed eager to talk, or at least eager to have someone to talk with. He never told me anything that would connect him to 9 deaths, mostly about where he'd been, things he'd read. He read a lot, just about anything he could get his hands on. I got the impression he hadn't really lived life so much as he'd read it. All the things he knew about had never physically affected him. He was like an insulated island. Life flowed around him but never touched him. I wondered if the hump on his back made that much difference, if it made him such a green monkey he'd had to retreat into his insular existence. Practically everyone I had talked to liked him, mixing with varying portions of pity, to be sure, but liking nevertheless. Harry Spinner had liked him, but had discovered something peculiar about him. Bertie Pavlovitz, Maurice Millian, David Fowler, Lorraine Nesbit, they all liked him. And goddamn it, I liked him too. At midnight I was still awake, sitting in number 5 in my jockey shorts with the light out and the door open. I listened to the ticking of the Detweiler Boy's typewriter and the muffled roar of Los Angeles, and thought and thought and thought, and got nowhere. Someone walked by the door quietly and carefully. I leaned my head out. It was Johnny Peacock. He moved down the line of bungalows, silent as a shadow. He turned south when he reached the sidewalk, going to Selma or the boulevard to turn a trick and make a few extra bucks. Lorraine must keep tight purse strings. Better watch it, kid. If she finds out, you'll be back on the streets again, and you haven't got too many years left where you can make good money by just getting it up. I dropped in at the office for a while Friday morning and checked the first-of-the-month bills. Miss Tremaine had a list of new prospective clients. Tell everyone I can't get to anything until Monday. She nodded in disapproval. Mr. Bloomfeld called. Did he get my report? Yes, he was very pleased, but he wants the man's name. Tell him I'll get back on it Monday. Mrs. Bushyeager called. Her sister and Mr. Bushyeager are still missing. Tell her I'll get on it Monday. She opened her mouth. If you say anything about my bank account, I'll put Spanish Fly in your Ovaltine. She didn't humph. She giggled. I wonder how many points that is. That afternoon I played gin with the Detweiler Boy. He was genuinely glad to see me, like a friendly puppy. I was beginning to feel like a son of a bitch. He hadn't mentioned North Carolina except that once, the day before, and I was extremely interested in all subjects he wanted to avoid. "What's it like in the Blue Ridge? Coon hunting and moonshine?" He grinned and blitzed me. "Yeah, I guess most of the things you read about are pretty nearly true. It's really a different world back in there with almost no contact with the outside." "How far in did you live?" "About as far as you can get without coming out the other side. Did you know most of the people never heard of television or movies, and some of them don't even know the names of the president? Most of them never been more than 30 miles from the place they were born, never saw an electric light. You wouldn't believe it. But it's more than just things that are different. People are different, think different, like a foreign country." He shrugged. "I guess it'll all be gone before too long, though. Things keep creeping closer and closer." "Did you know I never went to school?" he said, grinning. "Not a day of my life. I didn't wear shoes till I was 10. You wouldn't believe it." He shook his head, remembering. "Always kind of wished I could have gone to school," he murmured softly. "Why did you leave?" "No reason to stay. When I was 8, my parents were killed in a fire. Our house burned down. I was taken in by a balmy old woman who lived not far away. I had some kin, but they didn't want me." He looked at me, trusting me. "They're pretty superstitious back in there, you know. Thought I was marked. Anyway, the old woman took me in. She was a midwife, but she fancied herself a witch or something, always making me drink some mess she'd brewed up. She fed me, clothed me, educated me, after a fashion, tried to teach me all of her conjures, but I never could take him seriously." He grinned sheepishly. "I did chores for her and eventually became a sort of assistant, I guess. I helped her deliver babies a couple of times, but that didn't last long. The parents were afraid me being around might mark the baby. She taught me to read, and I couldn't stop. She had a lot of books she dredged up somewhere, most of them published before the First World War. I read a complete set of encyclopedias published in 1911. I laughed. His eyes clouded. "Then she died. I was 15, so I left. I did odd jobs and kept reading. Then I wrote a story and sent it to a magazine. They bought it, paid me $50. Thought I was rich, so I wrote another one. Since then, I've been traveling around and writing. I've got an agent who takes care of everything, so all I do is just write." Detweiler's flush of health was wearing off that afternoon. He wasn't ill, just beginning to feel like the rest of us mortals. And I was feeling my resolve begin to crumble. It was hard to believe this beguiling kid could possibly be involved in a string of bloody deaths. Maybe it was just a series of unbelievable coincidences. Yeah, unbelievable was the key word. He had to be involved, unless the laws of probability had broken down completely. Yet I could swear Detweiler wasn't putting on an act. His guileless innocence was real, damn it, real. Saturday morning, the 3rd day since Miss Herndon died, I had a talk with Lorraine and Johnny. If Detweiler wanted to play cards or something that night, I wanted them to agree and suggest I be a fourth. If he didn't bring it up, I would, but I had a feeling he would want his usual alibi this time. Detweiler left his room that afternoon for the first time since I'd been there. He went north on Las Palmas, dropped a large manila envelope in the mailbox, the story he'd been working on, I guess, and bought groceries at the supermarket on Highland. Did that mean he wasn't planning to move? I had a sudden pang in my belly. What if he was staying because of his friendship with me? I felt more like a son of a bitch every minute. Johnny Peacock came by an hour later, acting very conspiratorial. Detweiler had suggested a bridge game that night, but Johnny didn't play bridge, and so they settled on Scrabble. I dropped by number 7. The typewriter had been put away, but the cards and score pad were still on the table. His suitcase was on the floor by the couch. It was riveted cowhide, of a vintage I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Though it wore a mellow patina of age, it had been preserved with neat's foot oil and loving care. I may have been mistaken about his not moving. Detweiler wasn't feeling well at all. He was pale and drawn and fidgety. His eyelids were heavy and his speech was faintly blurred. I'm sure he was in pain, but he tried to act as if nothing were wrong. "Are you sure you feel like playing Scrabble tonight?" I asked. He gave me a cheerful, if slightly strained, smile. "Oh, sure, I'm all right. I'll be fine in the morning." "Do you think you ought to play?" "Yeah, it takes my mind off my headache. Don't worry about it. I have these spells all the time. They always go away." "How long have you had them?" "Since I was a kid." He grinned. "You think it was one of those brews the old witch woman gave me caused it? Maybe I could sue her for malpractice." "Have you ever seen a doctor? A real doctor?" "Once." "What did he tell you?" He shrugged. "Oh, nothing much. Take 2 aspirin, drink lots of liquids, get plenty of rest, that sort of thing." He didn't want to talk about it. "It always goes away. What if one time it doesn't?" He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, and I knew why Lorraine said he had a lost, doomed look. "Well, we can't live forever, can we? Are you ready to go?" The game started out like a Marx Brothers routine. Lorraine and Johnny acted like 2 canaries playing Scrabble with a cat. But Detweiler was so normal and unconcerned, they soon settled down. Conversation was tense and ragged at first, until Lorraine got off on her career and kept us entertained and laughing. She had known a lot of famous people and was a fountain of anecdotes, most of them funny and libelous. Detweiler proved quickly to be the best player, but Johnny, to my surprise, was no slouch. Lorraine played dismally, but she didn't seem to mind. I would have enjoyed the evening thoroughly if I hadn't known someone nearby was dead or dying. After about 2 hours, in which Detweiler grew progressively more ill, I excused myself to go to the bathroom. While I was away from the table, I palmed Lorraine's master key. In another half-hour I said I had to call it a night. I had to get up early the next morning. I always spent Sunday with my mother in Inglewood. My mother was touring Yucatan at the time, but that was neither here nor there. I looked at Johnny. He nodded. He was to make sure Detweiler stayed at least another 20 minutes and then follow him when he did leave. If he went anywhere but his apartment, he was to come and let me know, quick. I let myself into number 7 with the master key. The drapes were closed, and so I took a chance and turned on the bathroom light. Detweiler's possessions were meager. 8 shirts, 6 pairs of pants, and a light jacket hung in the closet. The shirts and jacket had been altered to allow for the hump. Except for that, the closet was bare. The bathroom contained nothing out of the ordinary, just about the same as mine. The kitchen had 1 plastic plate, 1 plastic cup, 1 plastic glass, 1 plastic bowl, 1 small folding skillet, 1 small folding saucepan, 1 metal spoon, 1 metal fork, and a medium-sized kitchen knife. All of it together would barely fill a shoebox. The suitcase, still beside the couch, hadn't been unpacked, except for the clothes hanging in the closet and the kitchen utensils. There was underwear, socks, an extra pair of shoes, an unopened ream of paper, a bunch of other stuff necessary for writing, and a dozen or so paperbacks. The books were rubber-stamped with the name of a used bookstore on Santa Monica Boulevard. They were a mixture: science fiction, mysteries, biographies, philosophy, several by Colin Wilson. There was also a carbon copy of the story he'd just finished. The return address on the first page was a box number at the Hollywood post office. The title of the story was Death Song. I wish I'd had time to read it. All in all, I didn't find anything. Except for the books and the deck of cards, there was nothing of Andrew Detweiler personally in the whole apartment. I hadn't thought it possible for anyone to lead such a turnip existence. I looked around to make sure I hadn't disturbed anything, turned off the bathroom light, and got in the closet, leaving the door open a crack. It was the only possible place to hide. I sincerely hoped Detweiler wouldn't need anything out of it before I found out what was going on. If he did, the only thing I could do was confront him with what I'd found out. And then what, Mallory? A big guilty confession? With what you found out, he could laugh in your face and have you arrested for illegal entry. And what about this, Mallory? What if someone died nearby tonight while you were with Detweiler? What if he comes straight to his apartment and goes to bed? What if he wakes up in the morning feeling fine? What if nothing is going on, you son of a bitch? It was so dark in there with the curtains drawn that I couldn't see a thing. I left the closet and opened them a little on the front window. It didn't let in a lot of light, but it was enough. Maybe Detweiler wouldn't notice. I went back to the closet and waited. Half an hour later, the curtains over the barred open window moved. I had squatted down in the closet and wasn't looking in that direction, but the movement caught my eye. Something hopped in the window and scooted across the floor and went behind the couch. I only got a glimpse of it, but it might have been a cat. It was probably a stray looking for food or hiding from a dog. Okay, cat, you don't bother me and I won't bother you. I kept my eye on the couch, but it didn't show itself again. Detweiler didn't show for another hour. By that time I was sitting flat on the floor trying to keep my legs from cramping. My position wasn't too graceful if he happened to look in the closet, but it was too late to get up. He came in quickly and bolted the door behind him. He didn't notice the open curtain. He glanced around, clicking his tongue softly. His eyes caught on something at the end of the couch. He smiled. At the cat? He began unfastening his shirt, fumbling at the buttons in his haste. He slipped off the shirt and tossed it on the back of a chair. There were straps across his chest. He turned toward the suitcase, his back to me. The bump was artificial, made of something like foam rubber. He unhooked the straps, opened the suitcase, and tossed the hump in. He said something too soft for me to catch, and lay face down on the couch with his feet toward me. The light from the opened curtain fell on him. His back was scarred, little white lines like scratches grouped around a hole. He had a hole in his back between his shoulder blades, an unhealed wound big enough to stick your finger in. Something came around the end of the couch. It wasn't a cat. I thought it was a monkey, and then a frog, but it was neither. It was human. It waddled on all fours like an enormous toad. Then it stood erect. It was about the size of a cat. It was pink and moist and hairless and naked. Its very human hands and feet and male genitals were too large for its tiny body. Its belly was swollen, turgid, and distended like an obscene tick. Its head was flat. Its jaw protruded like an ape's. It too had a scar, a big white puckered scar between its shoulder blades, at the top of its jutting backbone. It reached its too large hand up and caught hold of Detweiler's belt. It pulled its bloated body up with the nimbleness of a monkey and crawled onto the boy's back. Detweiler was breathing heavily, clasping and unclasping his fingers on the arm of the couch. The thing crouched on Detweiler's back and placed its lips against the wound. I felt my throat burning and my stomach turning over, but I watched in petrified fascination. Detweiler's breathing grew slower and quieter, more relaxed. He lay with his eyes closed and an expression of almost sexual pleasure on his face. The thing's body got smaller and smaller, the skin on its belly growing wrinkled and flaccid. A trickle of blood crawled from the wound, making an erratic line across the Detweiler boy's back. The thing reached out a hand and wiped the drop back with a finger. It took 10 minutes. The thing raised its mouth and crawled over beside the boy's face. It sat on the arm of the couch like a little gnome and smiled. It ran its finger down the side of Detweiler's cheek and pushed his damp hair back out of his eyes. Detweiler's expression was euphoric. He sighed softly and opened his eyes sleepily. After a while he sat up. He was flushed with health, rosy and clear and shining. He stood up and went to the bathroom. The light came on and I heard water running. The thing was in the same place, watching him. Detweiler came out of the bathroom and sat back on the couch. The thing climbed onto his back, huddling between his shoulder blades, its hands on his shoulder. Detweiler stood up, the thing hanging onto him, retrieved the shirt and put it on. He wrapped the straps neatly around the artificial hump and stowed it in the suitcase. He closed the lid and locked it. I had seen enough, more than enough. I opened the door and stepped out of the closet. Detweiler whirled, his eyes bulging. A groan rattled in his throat. He raised his hands as if fending me off. The groan rose in pitch, becoming an hysterical keening. The expression on his face was too horrible to watch. He stepped backward and tripped over the suitcase. He lost his balance and toppled over. His arms flailed for equilibrium, but never found it. He struck the edge of the table. It caught him square across the hump on his back. He bounced and fell forward on his hands. He stood up agonizingly like a slow-motion movie, arching his spine backward, his face contorted in pain. There were shrill, staccato streaks of mindless torment. But they didn't come from Detweiler. He fell again, forward onto the couch, blacking out from pain. The back of his shirt was churning. The scream continued, hurting my ears. Rips appeared in the shirt, and a small, misshapen arm poked out briefly. I could only stare, frozen. The shirt was ripped to shreds. 2 arms, a head, a torso came through. The whole thing ripped its way out and fell onto the couch beside the boy. Its face was twisted, tortured, and its mouth kept opening and closing with screams. Its eyes looked uncomprehendingly about. It pulled itself along with its arms, dragging its useless legs, its spine obviously broken. It fell off the couch and flailed about on the floor. Detweiler moaned and came to. He rose from the couch, still groggy. He saw the thing, and a look of absolute grief appeared on his face. The thing's eyes focused for a moment on Detweiler. It looked at him, beseeching, held out one hand, pleading. Its screams became a breathless rasping. I couldn't stand it any longer. I picked up a chair and smashed it down on the thing. I dropped the chair and leaned against the wall and heaved. I heard the door open. I turned and saw Detweiler run out. I charged after him. My legs felt rubbery, but I caught him at the street. He didn't struggle. He just stood there, his eyes vacant, trembling. I saw people sticking their heads out of doors and Johnny Peacock coming toward me. My car was right there. I pushed Detweiler into it and drove away. He sat hunched in the seat, his hands hanging limply, staring into space. He was trembling uncontrollably, and his teeth chattered. I drove, not paying any attention to where I was going, almost as deeply in shock as he was. I finally started looking at the street signs. I was on Mulholland. I kept going west for a long time, crossed the San Diego freeway into the Santa Monica Mountains. The pavement ends a couple of miles past the freeway, and there's 10 or 15 miles of dirt road before the pavement picks up again nearly to Topanga. The road isn't traveled much, and there are no houses on it, and people don't like to get their cars dusty. I was about in the middle of the unpaved section when Detweiler seemed to calm down. I pulled over to the side of the road and cut the engine. The San Fernando Valley was spread like a carpet of lights below us. The ocean was on the other side of the mountains. I sat and watched Detweiler. The trembling had stopped. He was asleep or unconscious. I reached over and touched his arm. He stirred and clutched at my hand. I looked at his sleeping face and didn't have the heart to pull my hand away. The sun was poking over the mountains when he woke up. He roused and was momentarily unaware of where he was. Then memory flooded back. He turned to me. The pain and hysteria were gone from his eyes. They were oddly peaceful. "Did you hear him?" he said softly. "Did you hear him die?" "Are you feeling better?" "Yes. It's all over." "Do you want to talk about it?" His eyes dropped and he was silent for a moment. "I want to tell you, but I don't know how without you thinking I'm a monster." I didn't say anything. "He was my brother. We were twins, Siamese twins. All those people who died so I could stay alive." There was no emotion in his voice. He was detached, talking about someone else. "He kept me alive. I'll die without him." His eyes met mine again. "He was insane, I think. I thought at first I'd go mad too, but I didn't. I think I didn't. I never knew what he was going to do, who he would kill. I didn't want to know. He was very clever. He always made it look like an accident or suicide when he could. I didn't interfere. I didn't want to die. We had to have blood. He always did it so there was lots of blood and so no one would miss what he took." His eyes were going empty again. "Why did you need the blood?" "We were never suspected before." "Why did you need the blood?" I repeated. "When we were born," he said, and his eyes focused again, "we were joined at the back. But I grew, and he didn't. He stayed little bitty, like a baby riding around on my back. People didn't like me. Us. They were afraid. My father and mother, too. The old witch woman I told you about, she birthed us. She seemed always to be hanging around. When I was 8, my parents died in a fire. I think the witch woman did it. After that, I lived with her. She was demented, but she knew medicine and healing. When we were 15, she decided to separate us. I don't know why. I think she wanted him without me. I'm sure she thought he was an imp from hell. I almost died. I'm not sure what was wrong. Apart, we weren't whole. I wasn't whole. He had something I didn't have, something we'd been sharing. She would have let me die, but he knew and got blood for me. Hers." He sat staring at me blankly, his mind living the past. "Why didn't you go to a hospital or something?" I asked, feeling enormous pity for the wretched boy. He smiled faintly. I didn't know much about anything then. Too many people were already dead. If I'd gone to a hospital, they'd have wanted to know how I'd stayed alive so far. Sometimes I'm glad it's over. And then, the next minute, I'm terrified of dying. How long? I'm not sure. I've never been more than 3 days. I can't stand it any longer than that. He knew. He always knew when I had to have it. And he got it for me. I never helped him. Can you stay alive if you get regular transfusions? He looked at me sharply, fear creeping back. Please, no. But you'll stay alive. In a cage, like a freak. I don't want to be a freak anymore. It's over. I want it to be over. Please. What do you want me to do? I don't know. I don't want you to get in trouble. I looked at him, at his face, at his eyes, at his soul. There's a gun in the glove compartment, I said. He sat for a moment, then solemnly held out his hand. I took it. He shook my hand, then opened the glove compartment. He removed the gun and slipped out of the car. He went down the hill into the brush. I waited and waited, and never did hear a shot.
In his tome, Dance Macabre, Uncle Stevie shared this. Here is the final truth of horror movies. They do not love death, as some have suggested. They love life. They do not celebrate deformity, but by dwelling on deformity, they sing of health and energy. By showing us the miseries of the damned, they help us to rediscover the smaller, but never petty, joys of our own lives. They are the barber's leeches of the psyche, drawing not bad blood, but bad anxiety. For a little while, anyway. I think Remy provides a nice counterpoint to this view of providing catharsis to the masses. Sometimes people just are. The desk clerk with the eye patch was no more or less competent with one eye less than normal. Andrew Detweiler adopts a deformity to protect his brother and keep him close. While it colors the views of others, he does not allow that to compromise his generally positive attitude and decency towards others. Still, Andy Detweiler loves and fears his brother. Andy relies on his monstrous acts to survive, but regrets the damage they inflict. A vampire by proxy, filled with self-loathing and existential guilt. The 70s began the reintroduction of the vampire as a romantic figure of a fallen angel, painted with black wings. But it would take decades before they really inhabited the shadows. That's not all that lurks in the shadows. This grimy window onto Los Angeles looks out onto ghettoization and exploitation that Hollywood would like you to pretend has never existed. If they do acknowledge it, they'll pretend that it is something in the past and that everything is much better now. Not all vampires wear capes. I've worked my way through all of Tom Remy's published fiction, and we may bring more to you soon. If you hunt down one book, look for San Diego Lightfoot Sioux and Other Stories. This collects most of his excellent short fiction, including the titular novella, which won the Nebula. That story is one of the most excellent subversions of Disney princess tropes without ever feeling like a subversion. He populates his worlds with a diverse cast that feels fresh, even though it's over 40 years old. The populace of these gritty stories feel uncomfortably familiar and shines a light on the struggles of the outcasts and freaks. I wonder if any of the residents worked with Remy when he served in the art department as property master on the cult movie Flesh Gordon. If those stories leave you hungry for something a bit longer, his novel, Blind Voices, was published posthumously. It has a bit of a first novel feel, and was probably waiting for one final round of polish before sending it out into the world. And yet, it's still an excellent intense story about a sideshow that fans of Something Wicked This Way Comes should seek out. With this story, we've made it past another milestone, and we couldn't have done that without our incredible team of voracious giblins. So some thanks and acknowledgements are in order. To my co-editor, Sean Garrett. To Karen Bovenmeyer, our assistant editor. To Chelsea Davis and Marty Perrette, our audio producers who make us sound good. To Brian Lieberman, who serves as our community manager and runs our flash fiction contests, in addition to being an associate editor. And to all of our fantastic associate editors, Shauna Borman, Tad Callan, Scott Campbell, Kat Day, Cecilia Dawkins, Jack Evans, Adrian Howard, Kate Castelline, Austin Malone, Elizabeth Rogers, Kitty Sarkozy, M.M. Schill, and Victoria Winnick. This engine cannot stay oiled without your efforts. Special thanks to our Artemis Rising team this year, including guest editors Cecilia Dawkins and Tanya Thompson of the Nightlight podcast. Thank you for another fantastic year of lifting voices up. Last but not least, thank you to our regular host, Alistair Stewart, who's been nominated for a Hugo for Best Fan Writer. We'd like to think this is at least in some small part for his powerful outros and commentary on this podcast. If you want some of those to grace your bookshelf, Pseudopod Tapes Volumes 1 and 2 are available for you to own at the click of a button. Want to help ensure we make it to episode 700? Slither over to pseudopod.org and click on Feed the Pod to subscribe. Pseudopod is part of Escape Artists Incorporated and is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Theme music is by permission of Anders Manga. Pseudopod knows these are the town's secrets, and some will later be known and some will never be known. The town keeps them all with the ultimate poker face. The town cares for devil's work no more than it cares for God's or man's. It knew darkness. And darkness was enough.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.